conversion from Saul to Paul, Paul would have been a name that fit him for a lot of reasons. He was educated, and that's important to note because you have to remember at that time, not many people were. And so to be able to write and read would have been a very small slice of the population in Paul's day. And Paul could. And one of the interesting things about that is that when you think about Paul and what we have of Paul, which is his letters, okay, that's significant for a number of reasons. Paul, and as Sharon pointed out, and most of you already know this, much of the New Testament are letters attributed to Paul. Now, most biblical scholars will tell you this. We know that these 7 books of the Bible, these 7 letters, were almost definitively Paul's writings. Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1st Thessalonians, and Philemon. The other 6 that have Paul's name attributed to them, which is 2nd Thessalonians, Colossians, Ephesians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, and Titus, were probably not Paul. But they were probably one of Paul's disciples. In other words, somebody who was really close to Paul, that followed Paul, that was with Paul on many of his journeys, were probably the ones who authored those on Paul's behalf, which was also not uncommon in that time. It would have been somebody who was really respected Paul, loved Paul, knew Paul really well, and wanted to try and carry on Paul's legacy. And part of the reason we know that is because of the style of writing. Now, with all that said, the only other thing I want to say about that part of Paul is this. He was probably a better speaker than he was author. And so he made his reputation in that time by walking into the town square. And you saw this in the little video clip, even though it was funny. You saw him standing on that wooden box in the town square, kind of doing Paul's thing. Right? And that would have been Paul. He would have been bold enough to just go to the town center or to a natural amphitheater where he could project his voice and just start to talk about Jesus. And to anybody who would listen. It didn't matter to him. And that was one of the important things to note as well. He did not feel, and we talked about this earlier, that the Jews were the only people that deserved the message of Jesus. That was radical, right? Why? Why would that have been radical? Who were the Jewish people? The chosen ones, right? The chosen race. God's people. So, for Paul to say, nah, this isn't a message just for the Jews, would have been radical and was not even all that well received among his closest peers. Let's think for a second. Who were the people who were closest to Jesus when he died? The disciples, and who else? Were the disciples all men?
The women.
The women that were close to Jesus. His mother. Mary Magdalene. Other women who followed Jesus but were just never named as disciples because they were what? Women. And so, those that were closest to Jesus, particularly the disciples in this case, were the ones that were left to start the new church, or to start this new movement, really. The Way, it was called. Paul was not the most popular guy among many of the disciples. Why do you think? A couple reasons why. Why do you think? There's some obvious ones and some less obvious ones. Why would Paul have not been all that well received among Peter and the brothers? And why not?
He was a Roman citizen.
He was Roman.
He had persecuted the Christians.
He was chasing Christians down and killing them. Oh yeah? What else? Paul had this idea that it didn't matter if you were male, female, slave or free. Jew, Greek, Roman, Gentile, pagan, you deserved this identity as child of God if you chose to follow Jesus. And that Jesus' death and resurrection was for everybody. I had a seminary professor here at Gettysburg who used to say it this way. He said, the death and resurrection story of Jesus was the redemptive force for the cosmos. In other words, everything affected in all of God's creation was redeemed through the death and resurrection of Jesus. Now, in 21st century America and our global culture, that's still pretty radical. Because there are people who are self-identify as Christians who would say, what about the Muslims? What about the pagans? What about those who don't follow what we follow? So Paul's message was pretty radical. The other thing that was happening was Peter and some of the other disciples were pretty content with staying put. They felt like the message needed to be spread among the Jewish people in the places where they found themselves. Paul was the first one to be radical enough to go, this is too big. This is too big. I got to take this message as far as I can go. And no matter who I make angry with me, no matter who I piss off, I'm going to do it. And so he ends up getting stoned. He ends up getting beaten. He ends up being jailed. He ends up being cast out. He ends up being on the fringe. Everywhere Paul goes, he encounters this pushback from the people. But he also plants these small churches. He gets a couple people to listen to him, enough that the message spreads, right? So, Paul is not all that well received, even among Peter and the other disciples. And yet, would you and I be here today if it weren't for Paul? Maybe. But it's probably unlikely. In other words, God would have worked the way that God works. The Spirit would have moved the message forward. But Paul was the one who became that vehicle. Paul was the one who his efforts really pushed that message along. And so he's a really radically important person in the life of the church. And we in today's culture, I think we pay attention to that, but probably not as much as we could. One other thing that you guys ought to know before we make this move forward out of Paul's life itself is this. We as Lutheran Christians, in other words, people who follow Christianity through the lens of the Lutheran tradition, all right? We most certainly would not be here if it weren't for Paul. Because Martin Luther and many of the other reformers, and particularly Luther himself, really got their identity from reading Paul. Martin Luther was struggling with this idea that God was really vengeful and had high expectations for us as his children and could get pretty angry. And so Luther really had this impression of God as being this really kind of like stern father. And Luther's mentor in the faith, who was a monk, a priest that was helping him to kind of discern what God was up to in Luther's life, very wisely said to him, you really ought to read some of Paul's letters. Because Luther had been dwelling in the law. Luther had been dwelling in the Old Testament. Luther had been dwelling in this idea that we had to meet God's standards. And so Paul reads Romans, the book of Romans. He also reads Galatians, Ephesians, and a number of other letters of Paul. And suddenly, Luther's understanding of God changes. And he begins to see God as a loving father instead of a stern father. And he begins to see God through the person of Jesus Christ in a different way. And begins to understand his own relationship with God through the lens of Jesus. And that changes everything for Luther. And as a result, for many of us. Because Luther begins to write about it, Luther begins to talk about it, and what happens to Luther in the church that he's from?
Got excommunicated.
Much of the same thing that was happening to Paul. Luther becomes the kind of guy who's standing in the village square saying, right, and not everybody's listening. But fortunately, enough people did that we began to think differently about the church and about ourselves as children of God. Questions? I said a lot, and I apologize. I get kind of carried away with this stuff. What I want to do for a little while is I want us to start thinking about all these ideas through the lens of history. I want to move us out of the biblical era into the American Christian experience. And I want to do that by getting us outside this building in a minute or two and to think about where we're sitting right now. What's significant about the Lutheran Seminary here at Gettysburg? Anybody know? Anybody know? What's significant about where we're at right now? And the land around us?
You mean the Civil War?
Yeah, American Civil War. Okay? The American Civil War. One of the bloodiest, ugliest, nastiest battles was fought where we're sitting right now. And the town behind us, and the hills behind us. And there's a lot to learn about that. And it's interesting that it happened here. And it's interesting that this seminary was here before it happened. So we're going to get outside in a minute, and we're going to talk a little bit about that particular battle and that particular day and what all happened. And if you're a history geek, you'll really like it. And if you're not, there might be still some things you go, ooh, that's interesting, I didn't know that. I hope. And then we're going to talk about it through the lens of what we're learning about Paul and about who we understand ourselves to be as a result of Paul's teachings. Sound good? All right, so let's stretch. Let's get up. You will want a jacket because we'll be outside for a little while. We're going to go upstairs in this building first because I want you to get